Welcome to Alex J. If you were following, I changed the channel name. I used to go by AJ, which I used kind of as a nickname here and there for myself, but my real name is Alex. Give you a little background, I was a mechanic. I went to school to be a mechanic, did mechanic life for a while. Wanted to try another career out, so I got out of it. Plus, working as a mechanic, I kind of realized I didn't want to be a mechanic for the rest of my life. It's pretty tough work, and I personally am not a huge fan of the way the general mechanic shop works. So like everything's about time. For instance, if you don't know, we'll just start with this. If you don't know, the way a mechanic generally gets paid is that each job is allotted a certain amount of labor or time that you have to do that job. So for instance, like a brake job, if you're doing front brakes on a car and you're doing pads and rotors, I worked at a Ford dealership. At that dealership, it paid an hour and a half. That was an hour and a half to get the car in, if it wasn't already in, take the wheels off, take the brakes apart, put all the new parts in, have it all bolted back together and ready to go. Hour and a half, which honestly, for the most part, was pretty easy to do. It's pretty easy to do it. You know, if you're really hauling, you could have it done well under an hour. Now, my problem with that is that over time, everything becomes about the time and the tenth and trying to earn that little bit more, hit your 40. And the way I worked is I wasn't super motivated to try and crush hours. I more wanted to do a good job and, you know, diagnose and repair it well. And, you know, not having a ton of experience, I only worked as a journeyman mechanic for a couple of years. I didn't have the experience to get like really fast at repairing stuff, but yeah, I was decent. I turned decent hours, but I was never crushing like 50, 60 hours every week. I'd have the occasional week where I'd hit like 60 hours, but anyway, it's just not the way I wanted to work. I kind of figured out that I didn't want to be a mechanic for my entire life, and so I got out of it and did something different. Anyway, long story short, in case you are looking at something like this, or you have a older car you've always wanted, or, you know, whatever it is, you have some car you want to work on, I'll just tell you, you don't need to have been a mechanic to do the work. Honestly, a lot of this stuff is fairly straightforward. Like, it's not hard to, for instance, I'm standing on a front subframe right now out of a Miata. Taking it out, especially because there was an engine and stuff in there, but like in itself, it's just held in there by a handful of bolts. Like, you gotta undo the struts. There's some other mounting bolts, some other stuff, but you know, it's not rocket science, so to speak. So if you're looking at this thinking, I don't know how to work on cars, I don't know how to do any of that, I hear you. I'm telling you, it's not super hard. There's a ton of other videos on YouTube probably explaining exactly what you're trying to do. Just pay attention to the details and try and do it, and you'll learn something. You know, start off changing oil or doing brakes and kind of work your way up. You know, maybe swapping out, you know, to coilovers if it's a performance application or something. A bunch of this stuff isn't super hard. It can be a pain to do. Like, it can be tough to get to some of these bolts and not very much fun, but it's not, a lot of it isn't super technically hard. So anyway, that's my long story short about kind of who I am and why I encourage you to go do it. And that's part of what brought me to this Datsun. So this is a 240Z. I've always liked 240Zs. I love the way they look. I've wanted one for a long time. I found one with relatively minimal rust. I'll bring you through all the stuff I found later. It's a little rougher shape than I originally thought when I bought it. Like, I taught myself basically well, I did teach myself how to weld, and I've been teaching myself how to fabricate, and I just watch videos on it and try and learn and then try and do it myself. And so I encourage you to go do it. And you might find it's not for you. You might find it's, you know, too much, or you don't want to, you know, pay for some of the tools, because some of the tools that do this stuff isn't cheap. But you might find you like it, and you might find, you know, you just tinker away doing simple stuff. It's a good hobby in terms of, like, I'm not knocking video games. I've played a lot of video games, but you could spend your whole weekend, say, playing a video game, or, you know, watching sports or doing whatever. You haven't really come away the weekend, you know, accomplished much physically. I can do some work on this, and at the end of the weekend, you know, I've physically built something or fixed something, or I'm that much closer to having this on the road. You know, it's like a physical, tangible thing. And that's part of the way I am. I'm like a physical person. Like, I like to work with my hands. And so for me, this is exciting. Plus, I'm a big car guy, and I'm pretty excited at the thought of getting to drive this around. Anyway, you're probably wondering how I dropped my Datsun on a jack. I'll just, you know what, we'll just roll the footage. So obviously now the Datsun's in the garage. As you saw, I dropped the car off the jack, did some damage. I'm pretty bummed about doing that. I knew better. I knew I should have just taken the extra time to, like, taken one of the subframes off of the dolly I had made and put it under the car, and it would have made it 10 times easier. So, advice for you at home: if you're watching this or paying any attention, take this one thing away. Do your best to recognize when it's time to take the extra 5 or 10 minutes to do something right or easier, and put that effort in the forefront to make your job better so you don't end up, you know, damaging the bumper on your Datsun, which now I have to fix. Which is another thing, I haven't done much metal work, but you know, I've watched some videos. I watched a lot of Make It Custom. I'll see if I can leave a link to it in the description or anything, but I've watched a lot of his metalworking videos. It's awesome. I'm kind of excited at the thought of trying to get it straight, to be totally honest, in a weird way, as it's something else I get to learn. Anyway, we're gonna cover now what I found as I've torn into this a little bit. As you can see, I've taken the door off. I've started going through some of it, so let's take a look. If you don't know much about Datsuns, there's a couple big areas that rust out. One is this hatch plate along here, because water tends to come in down the hatch and just sit here and rust this out. So when I got this car, I saw the hatch plate wasn't rusty. You know, there's some minor surface rust there, but it wasn't really rusty. I thought, that's an excellent sign. This battery tray, not rusted. It looks like someone replaced it at some point and there's some damage and funky stuff going on here, but I thought, you know, it's not rusted, which is the big one. I can figure out the damage and the other stuff later. The floors, there were a couple rust spots you could see on the floors, but again, it didn't look terrible. It looked like something you could patch. So what I did is I got the car in, and on the car was a bunch of sound insulation. It's like this hard glued on sound insulation that gets put on when they manufacture the car. It's kind of tough to get off. I've watched a few videos where they dry ice it, so I did that. I went and bought, I was like 10 pounds of dry ice or something, smashed it up into little cubes or smashed it with a hammer, and then you just pour it on the floor. It crackles, pops, and then you just wail on it with a mallet, like I use a soft blow mallet, and it just breaks the sound insulation right off. As you can see, the rust and corrosion was quite a bit worse than it initially looked. So these two are the parts that I could kind of tell. You could see right off. This one I missed, and it had been plated. They actually riveted a plate on here. And then the big one was the rust right here. So on these Datsuns, there's a frame rail that comes up and follows this kind of bulge right here in the floor, this little hump, and ends right here. Well, this is completely rusted. All right, we're on the passenger side. So as you can see, it's rusted over here too, and then over here up by the seam where the firewall kind of meets, it's getting pretty rusty and soft. Another big one is that it's rusty and soft. This is where the frame rail actually meets up to the firewall right here. I don't know if you can see through it, but the frame rail goes that way. So again, this car's a 1973. I wasn't expecting it to be perfect. It had a little more rust than I thought. I was thinking, get this car, not have to do floors, maybe just patch a couple rust holes. I wanted to put kind of street style cage in it for both safety and to help stiffen the chassis. It being an old 240Z, they're not the stiffest of chassis, and I got some big plans as far as what I'm doing with this car. Then I looked a little further. I don't know if you can tell, but that frame is bulged out. That one's nice and flat. That's bulged out. Something happened right here at some point. You can see the frame rail is kinked, and then I hammered it back out, but that corner of the transmission tunnel was kind of bashed in. So I think at some point, I don't know if it's when this front end damage happened, which I knew about when I bought the car. I don't know if they hit something and rolled over something, I'm not really sure if it was two separate incidents or the same one, but something did some damage up underneath. It might be tough on video, but you can see the floor is actually like bulged up. It's bent up in the middle here. So again, this thing went through something in its life, but we're here to fix it, make it better. So you might be thinking, all right, Alex, what are you gonna do with this thing? It's a lot of work. Yes, it is a lot of work. Basically, my plan right now is to swap the front and the rear with the subframes out of a Miata. I previously picked up the shell of a 94 Mazda Miata. I ripped the front and rear subframes out of it, and I plan on putting them in here. I'm not aware of anyone that's done that. I've heard of people doing the subframes out of a later Gen Z car, but never a Miata. Might be, why a Miata? Sorry. Why Miata? Why go through the insanity of trying to make subframes from an entirely different manufacturer fit in here? Two reasons. One, as this thing needs some body work anyway, I found a site that does what they call like a subtle wide body kit, so it adds 1.5 inches to each corner, and then I'm probably going to put wheel or fender flares on it to really widen it out. The Miata is a little bit wider in this car. This is a pretty narrow car, and I like the look of a low, wide car. So it gives me the ability to widen the vehicle without having to go to some crazy offset wheel or huge wheel spacers or anything. That's the shallow reason, if we'll call it that. The other reason is the Mazda Miata has a more modern suspension design. Like, it has upper and lower A-arms, which is superior to a McPherson strut style, which is essentially what this has. There's way more parts available for Miatas. Generally the parts are cheaper. There's more performance options, and they're less like specific, so to speak. So like, to get Datsun stuff to work well, you generally have to go to like these Datsun specific shops, and they'll have conversion kits or stuff, and you're just kind of always playing around or like dancing around the fact that this is a car designed in the 60s and it's just old. So I can put much newer stuff in, which means, you know, going with an NA, I can put, you know, more track oriented, larger brakes that'll still fit under a 15-inch wheel. That's the other thing I want to do with this, is I don't like the way these really look with anything larger than like a 15, 16-inch wheel. With 17s, I just think it's too big of a wheel for this car. I like the look of 15s with some tire on it. So anyway, I gotta figure out how to swap in those. Then it also didn't have an engine or transmission. So I've got this to solve the engine problem. This is a 5.3 liter LS, essentially. It's, the actual nomenclature is an L33, so it's an aluminum block, 5.3 liter. I'm not going to go into details too much, but we're slapping a V8 into it. I would like to do more eventually. I know it's another boring LS swap, but the flip side is I'm putting an LS into a Miata subframe into a Datsun. So hopefully it's at least a little bit interesting. Part of the reason I went with the LS here, one, they're cheap, and I don't have a lot of money. I don't have some 5-figure budget to do this car. I basically sold my daily driver to buy this car, and now I'm trying to make it all work. So I picked up this for under $1,000. I still got to figure out the transmission. I'm gonna do a manual. It's just how much I'm willing to fork over. But 300 horsepower, way more than that torque. You cam it. Like, for right now, I'm probably gonna keep it fairly stock, or at least to initially get the car up and running, I'm probably gonna leave it pretty much bone stock. Just because, one, I don't really have the money to do what I want to do with this, and two, that's one less kind of variable I have to worry about getting the car running, because the whole car is going to be, you know, new in a project, and I'm going to have a ton of stuff to figure out. So we're slamming an LS into it. What are we going to do about the frame and all this rust and firewall damage? My thought right now is I'm essentially going to do kind of a light tube chassis in the vehicle. So I think for this front end and stuff, I'm going to at the very least cut out the frame rails and create a tubular front where I'm going to have your main tubes taking place of these frame rails. Then I don't have to worry about straightening that or how dented it is. Just put nice fresh new stuff. I'll have another upper bar basically coming from the new strut tower that I make, which will integrate into the roll cage in here. And so it should be 2 bars interconnected a little bit up to the front radiator support area. I'll probably build out a little bit of a bumper out of lighter material, just as I'd say sacrificial kind of front. So ideally it'd be bolt up, and that way if something happens, hopefully it just messes up the front and leaves the bulk of this chassis unharmed. Right, inside, what are we doing? Well, again, it's going to be kind of a minimalist street cage. I don't want an aggressive race car style roll cage in here. I don't know if you've ever tried to get out of a race car seat in a caged car, but it's not the easiest thing in the world. And I want this, you know, it's going to be a street car, a fun street car. That'll probably track a little bit, but my goal with it is not to make a race car. So I'm not really going to have much of a door bar, or if I do, it's going to kind of stay by the seat. I'm thinking about doing a rail kind of tucked besides this rail, and then we'll have our front down bars, a dash bar, a hoop, and it'll probably tie into some lateral bars. And then this is the part I'm the least sure about how I'm going to go about, is the rear end, because the Mazda subframe, while mounting flat, like all the bolts are pretty much flat, the whole section itself is wider or longer, like in length with the car, than the way the subframe mounted up from the factory. So I'm either going to have to notch a lot of the frame out, or I essentially cut all the structural stuff out of the back of the Datsun and essentially make a tube chassis rear area that'll be tied into the roll cage. And if I go that route, I'm going to have to basically make paneling or try and save paneling and put it back in between cage members. I don't know. There's a lot to figure out. It's going to be a lot of work. But at the end of this, I should have a pretty stout 240Z on modern suspension with modern brakes, the modern engine, and a modern transmission. I mean, it's essentially a Restomod. And it hopefully will be pretty light. I'm hoping this thing will be under 2,500 pounds. And My main goal with the car is for it to be an analog driving experience. So I've already have a depowered Miata rack. It was depowered properly. I'm debating about running manual brakes because the thing with running the Miata parts is they sell a lot of brake kits, and it wouldn't be super hard to go to Willwood or whoever and have them spec out a brake master cylinder for the brakes that I'll have on the car. You know, that'll be a compromise between effort and pedal throw and all that. But I want this to be analog. My last car, Daily Driver, was a manual, and I love driving manuals, but it was this weird middle ground where it wasn't aggressive enough for me to like get that need to have like a weekend warrior car. And it wasn't comfortable enough to be like a super comfortable daily driver. Like, it was a good, nice, comfortable car. It just, for me personally, ended up in this weird middle ground. And I just want more out of manual car that I'm driving. So I'm gonna make myself a manual sports car. And for those of you, because I have friends that have told me this, are baffled by the fact that I would take a car and then try and change everything about it. I'll just explain how I think about that. I'm sure most of you have something in your life that you customized, made your own to some extent, whether, it could be your bedroom, a gaming PC, your own car, a workshop, a boat, your garage, who knows? This is basically that for me. Like, I love the way the old Datsuns look. However, I think I can make it better. And part of that is with the suspension and steering and engine choice. Now, for those of you who are gonna, fiercely type away, oh, another LS swap, I get it, but I'm not rich. And for me, the value proposition of spending, a couple $1,000s when it's all said and done to swap in either the original inline six, which is cast iron, and maybe makes 150 horsepower, or there were other inline six options, because I'd really love to put an inline six in it. There's the RB series from Nissan, but they're kind of finicky, and again, several $1,000s, and to do it naturally aspirated, which is important to me. I'm not turbocharging it, I'm not supercharging it. I want this thing pure analog mechanical interface between myself and the vehicle. And all the inline six options, they're not, I didn't really realize this till I looked into it, but they're not for naturally aspirated. Almost every inline six that is performance oriented is boosted, with the one exception, and I can't remember the actual engine term, but the BMW inline six that came in the E46 M3. It's a 3.2 liter, 333 horsepower. Would be an awesome engine, but they're like 10 grand. And that's currently more than my entire budget for this car. And then, there's obviously the 2JZ, the Toyota inline six, but that's an iron block. I really don't want to shove an iron block if I don't have to. I want to save as much weight as possible. And again, same thing, naturally aspirated, they don't make that much horsepower. Like, you could dump a ton of money into a 2J, thousands of dollars, and it might maybe make 300 horsepower. That LS behind the camera is 300 horsepower just sitting there for under $1,000. And I think LS's sound pretty good. I have some ideas about how I want to mess with the exhaust to try and make this thing sound the way I want it. I want like a high RPM build. So down the road, I've got ideas of what I want to do this that I think will be cool. But for now, I'm just trying to get the car together and working at, you know, a somewhat modest budget. So if that interests you at all, I would encourage you to keep watching the videos, like and subscribe if you can. But anyway, take care. Hopefully next video will have a little bit more action in it. I just wanted to get through this, kind of explain who I am, where I came from, what I'm doing with this car. I'll see you next time. Take care.